Alrighty then. It is the Got News podcast for Wednesday. This is your most ginger host, Chuck Johnson. Although technically I'm not a ginger, I'm a day walker. Common mistake. And yes, my hair is thinning. As you can see, it's wet. Common trait among redheads. But you didn't come here to talk about that. You came here to talk about the news and how crazy things are getting in the election, in fighting the social justice warriors, and so forth. Um, this podcast is going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk about the moral case for internet tribalism and internet gang warfare. Um, these are metaphors, by the way. Don't kick me off YouTube. Please don't kick me off YouTube for using metaphors like Twitter did. Um, but nonetheless, here we are. Here's what we're talking about today. Um, there's a larger kind of meta theory that goes through most of my work, and it's about how globalization sort of built the conservative and liberal movements of the post-World War II period. Essentially, Americans, got rich from Europe blowing itself up. We were very good about making the world the dollar, the dollar, the world's reserve currency. Very good about protecting the peace with our boys and our military. And so what happened was we got very, very rich. And it was pretty easy to get pretty rich because technological progress was growing. We had a majority white nation. That white nation was growing after the baby boom. I mean, there was sort of all the demographic factors were aligning. That isn't true anymore. So what's actually happening in the West is a total collapse. Partly this is because of the central bank, which essentially by doing credit allocation leads to prices running up for real assets, things like housing, that sort of thing, which affects affordable family formation, which makes it so it's harder for the white Americans, older Americans, that sort of thing, to have children. And so what ends up happening is you have to import a labor force. In Europe, they imported the Muslims. In America, we import the Central Americans and Mexicans. What ends up happening is that the Central Americans and the Muslims are not as intelligent, not as hardworking as the white stock. And so what ends up happening is you get a collapse. Um, uh, and so that gives you kind of the backdrop of what's going on. Now, it's an interesting, we're in an interesting time. We're having a very good time lately in what's going on in the larger culture. So that gives you kind of the backdrop. Now, as we got richer as a society, we had two choices. We had a choice between, on the one hand, growing our economy by doing things like tax cuts, which of course just postpone the inevitable, or we could build a giant military, or we could build a giant welfare state. And we essentially decided we're just going to do all of the above. And so right now, as a society, we are broke. And here we are, here we are right now, April 2016. And what's happened is our society is collapsing because of demographic changes, because of all the sort of things that's going on. Now, that's sort of where we are right now. That's the larger narrative. That's what's actually happening. So yeah, it's kind of exciting, kind of crazy, but kind of exciting. Now what's happening now that globalization is peaking is that you're seeing a return to ethnic tribalism. You see this after the collapse of all empires. You saw the collapse of the British Empire, rise of nationalism in Africa, rise of sort of maybe even punk rock in UK. And you saw it after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, where there are all these nations that formed out in the decay of the Habsburg Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this is a very common kind of thing. And it's happening in the United States too now. So that gives you somewhat of a sense of like what's really going on. Now, why does this matter? Why is this interesting? Well, it matters because a lot of our institutions are built on this idea of universalism, that if Facebook works well for college students at Harvard, it must work well for all Americans, all people in the West. And if it must work well for all people in the West, it must work well for all humans. And so, Mark Zuckerberg will run around trying to convince the Chinese government to be nicer to him, uh, and to be, he'll be anti-walls, and that's sort of where we're going. But as Pax Dickinson, my CTO a former CTO of Business Insider, told me, um, he said, let me pull it up. Um, this is what he said, and I think this is important. Um, it gives you a sense of kind of where we're going. Today's social sites assumed we all want to get along, but the next wave of social startups will know people are tribal and petty and spiteful. I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. And of course, they won't be necessarily venture backed. They'll be backed by wealthy individuals. They'll be backed by the crowd at large. And this is sort of what we're trying to do with Researcher. This is the future of the internet, and it's a very exciting time to be alive, because it's leading to all sorts of fighting back and forth. And what's interesting, a lot of people have figured this out, but it bears repeating. Most of the social justice warriors that are out there are cowards, and they have no real infrastructure to protect them for when you punch back. They're so used to being on the side of righteousness that they're constantly aggressive. They have no defensive posture. So the second you stand back and just clock them in the face, metaphorically speaking, of course, they recoil, they collapse, and oftentimes the attack is over. And they go, the attack ends against you, or they move on to another target. And what ends up happening is you build followers because you're perceived as strong. Bin Laden wasn't wrong when he said that people prefer a strong horse to a weak horse, and you appear to be the strong horse when you fight back against the social justice warriors. Now, I've used this tactic several times. One example that comes to mind is when the New York Times all but published the address of Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot and killed Michael Brown, who was assaulting him, and now is no longer a police officer because he dared to protect his own life. I've used this tactic by publishing the addresses of the two New York Times reporters. And when I did that, my website melted down. I got all these new followers. Everything went kind of crazy. That's sort of what needs to be done. And to a certain extent, the Vox Day people, by using this, Vox Day and by his supporters, the Ralph Retort, the people who are building a blacklist of blacklisters are doing the same sort of thing. That's why Reddit can't handle that's why they can't handle it. And so what's happening is we're leading to this society where things are much more tribal and much more vicious. And what's happening right now is a bunch of people on the internet, the alt-right and a number of others, are working together, and we are building our own institutions, our own funding sources, our own methods of expression, and we're communicating with each other through the networks that have been set up and funded by the large VC companies, things like Twitter, like Facebook, and so forth. But eventually we're going to be building our own sites, which are going to serve as our own clarion calls. The Right Scoop is sort of, or not The Right Scoop, excuse me, the rightstuff.biz are doing that. And so that's sort of the backdrop of what's going on right now. And so, yeah, I mean, here we are. This is the future of conversation. People are going to start doing much more bounties. They're going to start putting out targets on each other. They're going to start doing a lot more, in tribal societies. There are low groups but high trust within those groups, small numbers of groups, high trust. In multicultural societies, high numbers, low trust. Essentially, just read your Bowling Alone, read your Putnam, read your Sam Huntington, Clash of Civilizations. That was sort of my first exposure to tribalism. But that stuff's all going to start happening online, and it's going to lead to essentially an electronic civil war, where people are doxing each other, fighting each other in perpetuity. And the people who are going to suffer the most in this kind of electronic civil war are going to be those who have the most fragile careers, because they'll be in a position where they'll be amenable for things collapsing. And so that's sort of the backdrop of where things are going. So yes, that gives you some sense of what's going on. I always love having people tell me how I fucked up my sound. I always love getting messages, editor@gotnews.com. I just wanted to kind of riff on this SJW list. I think it's a great idea. I think more should be done to create blacklists of people who blacklist. Maybe we can change the tactic for the better. Unlikely, but maybe we can. And maybe a lot of people on the right, spend all this time trying to be the moral people and so on and so forth. But that gives you some sort of backdrop of where things are going on. So thanks so much, and look forward to hearing from you guys offline.